Right, so the idea of this video is that I'm getting a lot of questions recently on my LinkedIn and on the comments of my civil service videos. And I just wanted to make a quick video addressing some common questions that I'm getting about the civil service interview process. So this isn't going to be like what behaviour questions you might get asked and stuff like that, but this is more around the process itself. I'm going to do it quickly. I've got some notes written down and hopefully this will just help people answer some general questions. And I was actually on a panel answering questions regarding civil service interviewing the other week. I know, like, why am I on a panel? But a few of these questions kind of came up in the Q&A section and we didn't kind of get around to answering them. So I've made a quick note of a few of them and I'm also hopefully going to address them as well. I know a lot of you kind of followed me from that talk, so if you have subscribed after going to that talk and seeing me speak, hello, welcome, thank you very much for subscribing. But without further ado, let's just get straight into them. Okay, this is a very common one. Is it okay to use the same examples that you've used on your written application when you get to a face-to-face interview like this? Yes, it's absolutely fine, and I think the majority of people expect that. The other thing I would say to you is try and think of your examples from multiple perspectives. So if you're like myself, a lot of your time is maybe spent on a few larger projects, and you can cut those projects from a variety of different ways. So some projects will have a lot of communicating, team working, etc. So try and think of projects from different angles. But yes, it is absolutely fine to use the same examples that you use in your written application when it comes to interview. Okay, another common question I get is how many questions do you get asked per behaviour? As always, I can only give you what I've experienced, but generally I find that there's a strength question, a situational question, and then a competency past example question. So 3 questions usually for each behaviour. Sometimes, however, in the past, this can vary, and if you've got maybe 4 or 5 behaviours, there won't be like 3 questions per every single behaviour, because that would be sometimes 12 to 15 questions, and in an hour slot, obviously you're just not going to have time for that. So prep for 3 for each, but bear in mind that you might not get asked for 3. Okay, another common one I get is, because we're on Teams and kind of virtually interviewing like this, are the civil service asking strength questions? I haven't interviewed in a while, so I can't personally answer this, but when I interviewed maybe 6 months ago, I was asked strength questions, and I think a few of the people in the comments on one of my other videos said that they are asking strength questions. So just prep to be prepared for strength questions, and if they don't ask you, then, you know, happy days, but it's better to be over prepared than be caught off guard. Okay, moving on. I get a lot of questions recently about phone interviews. And unfortunately, I have never actually done a phone interview in the civil service, so I can't really answer any questions. So I reply with, sorry, I've never really been through this process. I have heard, and again, this is me hearing things, that a lot of the time these are kind of pre-recorded phone interviews and not full on behaviour star example style questions. So I can't really give you much advice on that. If anyone has done a phone interview, let people know down in the comments, and then hopefully you can kind of connect and share experiences with each other. The other thing that I get asked quite often is around personal statements. So generally I've found that there are 2 types of personal statements. So you'll get the one where it's like 1 or 2, maybe 3 behaviours, and there's 250 words for each question. For that, I would recommend using the STAR approach and also incorporate your lessons learned. Remember, I said that in another video. And then there's also the cover letter style 500 words, kind of outline why you're suitable for the role. For this, my approach has always been to go to the job advert, copy the essential criteria, it's usually towards the bottom, copy those bullet points, put it into a Google Doc or Microsoft Word, whatever you kind of prefer, and then just think of bullet points and examples of how you hit those criteria. After that, don't worry too much about if you're over the word count. Once you've demonstrated that you can hit them all, delete all the bullet points and then work on kind of crafting it so it fits together. That's how I always approach it, and it seems to have worked all right for me, so that's what I would recommend for those style of cover letters. But yeah, from my experience, it's either the kind of 250 words star examples or the 500 words more traditional cover letter. Another question that I've had in the past is around timings and whether you get timed on how long you have to speak for. So from my experience, I was told that strength questions you should generally try and talk for 3 minutes. However, I've never been stopped, or I don't think someone has ever said, right, I'm going to time you. So I think the general kind of guideline guidelines is 3 minutes, but I don't know if you're going to get stopped. Just kind of aim for 3 minutes if I were you. And then for the competency and the kind of situational behavior questions, I think that they recommend like 4 or 5 minutes. But again, I've been on interview panels and I've also interviewed, and I've never been stopped or stopped someone. The one thing I would say is that if you are going to talk for like 10 minutes on your competency style questions, I don't think you're probably prepared enough with your example, because you shouldn't spend too long setting the scene and kind of giving the situation. You should practice your answer so that it's fairly concise. 4 to 5 minutes should be ample time for you to include everything that you want to include. And then if you do get asked further questions, you can kind of clarify other things. But generally, I would recommend like 4 or 5 minutes. Practice maybe on camera like this if you have a Teams interview, or maybe just time yourself to a friend or something like that. I mentioned earlier that I was on a panel the other week talking about my experiences of the interview process. And someone asked a question where they said, what happens if the example that I've prepared for, what happens if the question doesn't get asked in the way that I've kind of prepared for it? And I know what you mean. If you have prepped for the question to be asked in a specific way, it can be difficult then if the wording is slightly different and you think, oh, my example doesn't quite fit this. My answer to that would be, if you have an example that you really want to use for a specific behavior, try and think of different ways that you can ask those questions and try and then answer the question by tailoring your example. You'll find that you will be able to do this, but I think the lesson here is don't prepare solely rigidly for tell me about a time that you've delivered about pace, or tell me about a time when you've communicated to a non-technical audience, and then all of a sudden you don't get asked that and it throws you off. So kind of try not to be so rigid in your approach and just kind of let things be a bit more fluid and on the spot. I know it's difficult. Over time, you will kind of get used to doing this. It's very, very common. It's a very, very common question. Try not to be too rigid in your approach and prepare for the example to maybe be asked in multiple different ways. A question that we had on the panel the other week was, how can you get the panel's attention back if you feel like you've lost them? And this kind of ties into what I was talking about earlier. You shouldn't really be losing them. I would suggest if you are losing them, you've probably spent too much time kind of setting the scene, context, or maybe you haven't been concise enough in your approach. You shouldn't be losing the panel. I think if you have lost them, it may be a good idea to say, sorry, I've gone a bit off track there. Can you just remind me of the question just so I make sure that I answer it? And that's a good way to kind of reset. Another question that we had is, can you use non-work examples? And I think if you haven't got work experience, then you're gonna have to. Like there's no other option. Obviously, it's always better if you have some relevant work experience, but employers understand if you're a graduate and you can only demonstrate maybe voluntary or university or college apprenticeship experience, employers understand that. If you haven't got work experience, they're going to kind of test your understanding in other ways. They're going to see, okay, can this person problem solve, and what have they done that can demonstrate that? If you haven't got work experience examples, then yeah, by all means, you're going to have to use university, college projects, maybe part-time jobs, apprenticeships, work experience. Yes, use them, but try and think about how you can apply them to the essential criteria, so you show that you can demonstrate it through that way, because you don't want to give something which is just completely irrelevant, because otherwise that doesn't really look great, does it? This is a good one. I think it varies on the department. When answering questions at interview, do the interview panel make it clear what behavior you're talking about? Do they say, right, now we're going to ask you questions about communicating and influencing? From my experience, this varies. So in the past, I've been asked a strength question. So say, are you a good communicator? And I'll answer it and talk about that. And then the interview panel will say, right, now we're going to ask you questions, behavior questions around communicating and influencing. So you can kind of get a vibe from the strength question, okay, we're going to talk about communicating. In the past, I've been told before the strength question, and then in that previous example, I was told after the strength questions. I think it varies depending on how each department does it, to be honest. But I would suggest that if you get asked a strength question, you'll probably get a vibe for what following behavior questions are going to come. It should be fairly obvious, so try not to worry about it too much. In my experience, at some point they will tell you what the behavior questions are, yes. Another frequently asked question I get is it okay to use notes and kind of prompts and stuff like that? I think this is funny because when you're on Teams and stuff, people wouldn't even know if you have notes, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But I think, yes, I think notes are absolutely fine. It's good sometimes to maybe have some bullet points and some sticky notes kind of lying around. I would say though that try not to script things. I don't think it's a great look when you kind of script all your answers out and your examples, and then you take a pause and you kind of flick through your book and then you read out an example. I think the reason they brought in the success profiles process is to try and get away from that. Yes, by all means have notes, but try not to script things. I don't think it's the right kind of mentality. I think you should try and think of things a little bit more fluidly. The other thing is that I haven't written down here, but if you want to write down the question, that is absolutely fine. If you say after the question's been asked to you, you say, can you repeat that again? I'd just like to write it down just for my understanding. Sometimes that helps people and that's absolutely fine. Also, the other thing you can do is if you have been asked a question, take a few seconds to pause. That's completely natural because then you'll come with a more composed, kind of elegant answer as opposed to just rushing into it straight away. So taking a pause, writing down a question, they're both absolutely fine as well. The final question that I've just remembered that is really, really important is for the behavior questions, remember that you can use the same piece of work or the same project for different behaviors. So I touched on this earlier a bit, but if you've got a large project and that's kind of been your main focus, then you can use parts of that project for communicating and influencing. You can use part of that for delivering at pace. I wouldn't recommend maybe using the same project for all behaviors. If you've been working on kind of similar projects or similar pieces of work, large pieces of work, it's absolutely fine to use different aspects of the same project or piece of work for different behaviors. I hope that kind of covers a lot of frequently asked questions. It does for me anyway. I think I've gone through my entire list. If you have any more, please feel free to leave them down in the comments and I'll make another video because it's good for me as well because I can just signpost people to this video. I get a lot of DMs now on LinkedIn, in the comments, etc. And I try my best to answer them all, but obviously sometimes I am gonna miss them. Final reminder, if you are applying for a job in the civil service and you want an applicant's perspective, check out my playlist here. There's 8 or 10 videos now. I've helped loads of people and it's great to see people getting jobs and stuff like that. I'm getting messages daily and it's great to see. Thanks very much for watching. Take care and I'll see you soon.